Continental system. Napoleon Bonaparte. Britain. 1806 to 1811. A war that ends in a way wars are not supposed to end, not on a battlefield, but inside ledgers, ports, and empty warehouses. Napoleon tries to starve Britain by sealing Europe. Britain answers by strangling the empire that surrounds him, using blockades, credit, shipping insurance, and pressure on neutral trade. The result is not immediate. It is slow, invisible, and corrosive. But why did a strategy that avoids decisive land battles become a decisive weapon? Why did Napoleon, the master of rapid victory, get dragged into a fight he could not finish quickly? And if this was so effective, why did it also plant the seeds of political fracture and human suffering across Europe? Because this was not just economic pressure. It was operational warfare, disguised as commerce. This episode is not about who won which battle, or how many soldiers marched where. It is about a strategic dilemma that should not have existed, yet came to define the war. Britain faced an enemy that dominated the continent. Napoleon controlled manpower, territory, and momentum. On land, Britain could not meet him symmetrically without risking annihilation. The conventional solution was escalation, raise larger armies, seek decisive engagements, gamble on one crushing blow. Britain rejected that logic. Instead, British leadership framed the war as a systems problem. They asked a different question, not how to defeat Napoleon's armies, but how to make Napoleon's empire unsustainable. How to force a continental power to bleed through trade dependency, financial strain, alliance fatigue, and administrative overload. This is what makes the strategy fundamentally unorthodox. It treated commerce as terrain, shipping as maneuver, credit as morale, time as a weapon. But this choice carried an uncomfortable implication. If the strategy failed, Britain would not lose a battle. It would lose years. Economic stability, political cohesion, international legitimacy. This was a wager that could not be reversed halfway. And it was built on one fragile assumption, that Napoleon's system would break before Britain's patience did. To understand why that assumption seemed reasonable, we must first map the strategic landscape that trapped both sides. To understand why Britain chose a strategy that looked indirect to the point of cowardice, we need to examine the strategic map as it actually existed, not as later narratives simplify it. By the mid-1800s, Europe was not a balanced chessboard. It was a tilted system. Napoleon controlled the continent's decisive mass. France and its satellite states provided manpower, conscription depth, agricultural base, and internal lines of communication. His armies could concentrate faster than any coalition force. His operational tempo punished hesitation. Every campaign reinforced a dangerous perception: resistance meant devastation. Britain faced this reality from across the Channel. On land, Britain was structurally constrained. Its army was smaller, slower to mobilize, and politically sensitive to mass casualties. A single catastrophic defeat on the continent could shatter domestic support for the war. Britain could not afford a symmetrical gamble. At sea, however, the equation inverted. Britain dominated maritime power. Not just in battleships, but in shipyards, sailors, ports, insurance markets, navigation networks, and global trade routes. The Royal Navy was not merely a military instrument. It was an enforcement arm for an economic system. This created an asymmetry that was not immediately obvious to contemporaries. Napoleon saw war through the lens of decisive force. Britain saw war as endurance under pressure. The strategic objectives on both sides reflected this divergence. Napoleon's objective was to compel Britain into submission by isolating it economically. If Britain could not trade, could not access European markets, and could not sustain its credit, the war would end without invasion. This logic produced the continental system. Britain's objective was the inverse. Britain did not need to conquer Europe. It needed Europe to become an unsustainable burden for Napoleon. The longer the system strained, the more brittle it would become. This created a paradox. Napoleon needed control to make his economic war work. Britain needed disorder. The constraints shaping this contest were severe. Geography favored Napoleon on land but trapped him within the continent. Britain, insulated by the sea, could project pressure without occupation. This separation created a strategic delay. Actions taken at sea took months to ripple inland. Effects were slow, cumulative, and hard to attribute. Time became a double-edged constraint. For Napoleon, time amplified administrative burden. Enforcing compliance across multiple states required surveillance, coercion, and constant intervention. Every year increased friction. For Britain, time threatened domestic exhaustion. Merchants suffered. Prices fluctuated. Neutral states protested. Political opponents questioned the morality and effectiveness of the blockade. Neither side had a clean clock. Logistics added another layer. Napoleon's armies lived off the land, but his empire lived off trade. Colonial goods, raw materials, naval stores, and financial instruments flowed through ports. Cut those flows, and shortages followed. Not immediately, but predictably. Britain's logistics were global. This gave resilience, but also vulnerability. Overextension could strain shipping, provoke neutral powers, or trigger backlash in distant markets. Then there was morale. Napoleon's system relied on confidence. Confidence of allies. Confidence of administrators. Confidence of populations that tolerated sacrifice because victory seemed inevitable. Britain's morale was different. It rested on institutions, credit, and the belief that time favored those who could endure. Here is the first major blind spot. Napoleon underestimated how economic pressure operates on empires versus islands. He assumed deprivation would collapse Britain quickly. He did not account for Britain's capacity to reroute trade globally, absorb losses through credit, and externalize pressure onto others. Britain, meanwhile, identified a different blind spot. Napoleon believed control equaled compliance. British strategists suspected the opposite. That forced compliance would generate evasion, black markets, resentment, and administrative overload. That enforcing economic warfare across unwilling partners would cost more than it delivered. This was not obvious. It was a hypothesis. One that could not be tested quickly. The strategic map also included neutral actors. States whose cooperation was coerced, negotiated, or manipulated. Their interests did not align cleanly with either side. Every enforcement action risked pushing them toward resistance or opportunism. This made the battlefield diffuse. There was no front line. There were ports, warehouses, customs offices, insurance desks, and political salons. Victory depended on pressure accumulation, not breakthrough. From a conventional military perspective, this looked like avoidance. From a systems perspective, it was engagement at depth. But there was a problem. If Napoleon recognized what Britain was doing early enough, he could adapt. He could liberalize enforcement, restructure trade flows, or redirect strategic focus. The British wager depended on one thing: that Napoleon would double down on control instead of questioning the premise. That assumption was about to be tested. And it is here, within these constraints, that orthodox military logic began to collapse under its own weight. Military doctrine of the early 19th century was clear on one point. Wars are decided by force concentration. You destroy the enemy's main army, occupy political centers, and impose terms. Everything else is secondary. Napoleon himself embodied this doctrine. Speed. Massachusetts' decisive engagement. He did not wait for enemies to weaken. He struck them while they were still organizing. From this perspective, Britain's behavior looked irrational. Britain refused to commit a large continental army. It avoided direct confrontation. It invested resources into blockades, customs enforcement, financial pressure, and diplomacy. These were not decisive instruments in the doctrinal sense. They were slow, indirect, and uncertain. Any orthodox strategist would have raised immediate objections. Economic warfare takes too long. It disperses effort. It invites retaliation. It risks political backlash. It does not guarantee collapse. And most importantly, it does not stop armies already in motion. According to doctrine, Britain should have sought one of two paths. The first was escalation. Build a mass army, land it in Europe, and gamble on a coalition victory. This meant accepting catastrophic risk. One failed campaign could end Britain's ability to continue the war at all. The second was accommodation. Accept Napoleon's dominance on the continent and negotiate from a position of maritime strength. This meant conceding Europe in exchange for survival. Britain rejected both. Why did doctrine not apply here? Because doctrine assumed a symmetry that did not exist. Napoleon's strength was operational dominance on land. Britain's strength was systemic dominance at sea and in finance. For Britain, attempting to fight Napoleon on his terms meant abandoning its only durable advantage. Doctrine also underestimated time as a variable. Napoleon's victories were fast. But his empire was slow. Every new territory added complexity. Every enforced rule increased friction. Doctrine focused on winning battles, not sustaining systems under stress. Britain's leadership identified this gap. They understood that Napoleon's victories created a fragile equilibrium. Rapid expansion required constant enforcement. Economic control required bureaucratic reach. Coalition management required concessions. All of this consumed political capital. Doctrine told commanders to exploit battlefield weaknesses. Britain chose to exploit structural weaknesses. There was another doctrinal blind spot. Most military theory treated civilians as background. Economic pressure on populations was considered collateral, not strategic. Britain inverted this assumption. It recognized that civilian hardship translated into political pressure, resistance, evasion, and administrative strain. This was uncomfortable. It raised moral questions. It blurred lines between combatant and non-combatant. But it also created leverage. Doctrine also failed to account for denial strategies. Traditional military thought prioritized seizure and destruction. Britain focused on denial. Denying access. Denying predictability. Denying stability. The goal was not to destroy Napoleon's forces directly. It was to deny him a stable environment in which those forces could operate indefinitely. This created a strategic asymmetry that doctrine could not resolve. If Britain fought conventionally, it risked annihilation. If Britain avoided fighting, it was accused of cowardice. If Britain chose economic warfare, it entered an undefined space where success and failure were hard to measure. Doctrine offered no guidance for this space. This forced British leadership to accept a dangerous conclusion. If they followed the rules, they would lose. So they chose to break them. But breaking doctrine is only the first step. A strategy built on denial, pressure, and time must rest on assumptions. And if even one assumption is wrong, the entire structure collapses. The next question was unavoidable. Who inside the British system was willing to make this call, defend it against opposition, and accept responsibility if it failed? Because the decision to fight Napoleon without fighting him openly did not emerge naturally. It had to be chosen, argued, and imposed. This strategy did not appear fully formed. It emerged through pressure, disagreement, and institutional friction. Inside Britain's leadership, there was no unanimous vision of how to defeat Napoleon. The army wanted relevance. Merchants wanted relief. Politicians wanted results they could defend in Parliament. Admirals wanted clarity of mission. None of these interests aligned cleanly. The proposal to rely on economic strangulation instead of decisive land war triggered immediate resistance. Critics argued that blockades punished British trade as much as enemy trade. Others warned that neutral powers would be alienated. Some feared escalation into global conflict with states Britain could not afford to fight simultaneously. And many doubted that economic pressure could ever force a military genius like Napoleon into strategic retreat. Yet a small group inside the British system saw something others missed. They recognized that Napoleon's empire was not a unified economic organism. It was a coerced network. A system held together by intimidation, legal decrees, and administrative reach that exceeded its capacity to enforce uniformly. The decision did not hinge on optimism. It hinged on pessimism about alternatives. A large-scale land commitment risked catastrophic defeat. Diplomatic accommodation risked long-term subordination. Economic warfare, for all its flaws, offered a third path, a way to fight without presenting Napoleon a battlefield where his advantages were decisive. Three core assumptions underpinned this choice. The first assumption was that maritime dominance could be converted into continuous pressure, not just episodic victories. Naval power would function as enforcement, surveillance, and deterrence simultaneously. The second assumption was that economic pain would not translate into unified resistance against Britain, but rather into fragmentation within Napoleon's system. Smuggling, corruption, and selective compliance were not bugs. They were expected outcomes. The third assumption was psychological. That Napoleon, faced with defiance and leakage, would respond by tightening control rather than relaxing it. That he would double down on enforcement, expanding the system's footprint until it became unmanageable. This was the most dangerous assumption. Because if Napoleon instead adapted, liberalized, or shifted strategy, the British approach would lose leverage. Pressure only works if the opponent responds predictably. Internally, this decision was not framed as brilliance. It was framed as necessity. British leadership accepted that success would not look like victory. There would be no surrender ceremony. No moment of confirmation. Only accumulating signals, rising costs, alliance strain, enforcement fatigue. They also accepted that failure would be slow and ambiguous. There would be no single moment to reverse course without admitting strategic misjudgment. This created a governance problem. How do you sustain political support for a strategy whose success cannot be easily measured, whose costs are visible, and whose moral implications are uncomfortable? The answer was institutional insulation. Decisions were dispersed across naval command, financial policy, and diplomatic channels. Responsibility was shared. Accountability was blurred. This was deliberate. The strategy could not survive if it depended on one personality or one office. It had to become systemic. And that transformation marked the point of no return. Once Britain committed to turning commerce into a battlefield, retreat was no longer an option. Every year of enforcement increased sunk costs, reputational stakes, and political exposure. The unorthodox decision had hardened into doctrine of its own. The question now was no longer whether the strategy made sense in theory. The question was whether it could function in reality, under friction, error, and human behavior. Because a strategy built on denial only works if it can be enforced without collapsing under its own contradictions. Execution exposed the true nature of the gamble. On paper, economic warfare looked clean. Control the sea lanes. Enforce port access. Restrict insurance. Pressure neutral shipping. Starve the enemy system of inputs. In practice, it was chaotic, adaptive, and fragile. The British blockade was not a wall. It was a mesh. Royal Navy patrols could not be everywhere at once. Enforcement depended on intelligence, cooperation from local authorities, and the willingness of merchants to comply. Smugglers exploited gaps. Neutral traders tested boundaries. Corruption emerged where enforcement met profit. This was expected. The strategy did not require perfect denial. It required persistent friction. Each intercepted shipment raised costs. Each delayed voyage increased uncertainty. Each insurance refusal rippled through credit markets. The goal was not to halt trade, but to make trade unreliable. Logistics became the center of gravity. British ships had to remain on station for months. Crews rotated. Supplies flowed. Shipyards worked continuously. Losses were absorbed. This was not a dramatic campaign. It was industrial-scale endurance. The risk was overextension. If the Royal Navy thinned its coverage to respond to crises elsewhere, pressure slackened. If maintenance faltered, gaps widened. The system demanded consistency more than brilliance. Meanwhile, enforcement created political blowback. Neutral states protested seizures. Merchants lobbied Parliament. Legal challenges questioned the legitimacy of blockade practices. Diplomats scrambled to manage fallout. Every enforcement action created a secondary problem. The strategy survived because it was modular. Pressure could be adjusted. Enforcement could shift. Diplomatic concessions could offset economic coercion. This flexibility was its strength. But flexibility also concealed danger. Two microcrises nearly unraveled the entire approach. The first was escalation with neutral powers. Aggressive enforcement risked drawing new enemies into the conflict. Each seizure had to balance deterrence against provocation. One miscalculation could open a new front Britain could not afford. The second was domestic fatigue. Economic disruption at home bred skepticism. Critics argued that Britain was bleeding itself while Napoleon marched unopposed. Support was conditional, not guaranteed. Execution also revealed an uncomfortable truth. Economic warfare does not discriminate. Shortages hit civilians before they hit generals. Ports stagnated. Industries contracted. Populations suffered without understanding why. This created moral pressure. British leadership had to justify a strategy whose harm was diffuse and whose benefits were abstract. Success was invisible. Failure was immediate. The greatest risk, however, lay elsewhere. The strategy depended on Napoleon responding as predicted. And as pressure mounted, he did respond. Not by abandoning the system, but by tightening it. Enforcement increased. Penalties escalated. Control hardened. The empire expanded its administrative reach, forcing compliance through surveillance and coercion. From a British perspective, this looked like confirmation. From inside Napoleon's system, it felt like suffocation. The contradiction sharpened. The harder the system pushed, the more resistance it generated. Smuggling networks grew. Officials looked away. Local elites hedged their loyalties. The strategy was working. But working slowly. And slow success creates a new danger. It tempts the opponent into decisions that accelerate collapse, or into adaptations that neutralize pressure entirely. At this point, the outcome was no longer driven by British action alone. It hinged on how Napoleon interpreted the pressure, and how he chose to respond. Because the next phase of the war was not shaped by what Britain did, but by how Napoleon misread why it was happening. Napoleon did not ignore the pressure. He interpreted it through the only framework that had ever worked for him: control. From his perspective, the problem was not the strategy itself. It was compliance. The continental system failed, in his view, because it was not enforced hard enough. Ports leaked. Officials looked away. Allies hedged. Neutral traders exploited ambiguity. This diagnosis was fatal. Napoleon assumed that tighter control would restore effectiveness. He believed discipline could replace consent. Surveillance could replace trust. Punishment could replace alignment. This reaction revealed the core misread. He treated economic warfare as a policing problem. Britain treated it as a systems problem. As enforcement intensified, unintended signals multiplied. Officials falsified reports to avoid punishment. Smuggling became institutionalized rather than marginal. Local elites complied publicly while defecting privately. Economic pain translated into political resentment, not unity. Napoleon's command structure amplified the error. Information flowed upward filtered by fear. Bad news softened. Resistance reframed as temporary disruption. Structural strain disguised as isolated misconduct. The system reported effort, not effectiveness. This created a feedback loop. Tighter enforcement produced more evasion. More evasion justified harsher enforcement. Each cycle increased administrative load and political hostility. From Britain's perspective, this was the desired reaction. They did not need Napoleon to fail immediately. They needed him to commit resources to internal control instead of strategic maneuver. To spend political capital enforcing rules instead of winning wars. The decisive misstep came when Napoleon externalized enforcement. To seal the system completely, he needed to bring non-compliant states into line. This transformed economic pressure into territorial expansion. Control required occupation. Enforcement required troops. Economic warfare became a driver of military overreach. Here, the strategic balance tipped. Napoleon was no longer choosing campaigns based on opportunity. He was reacting to pressure created by a system he could not relax without losing face. Each new commitment reduced flexibility. Each added front diluted focus. The irony was complete. Britain avoided decisive battle to preserve freedom of action. Napoleon pursued total control and lost it. This was not incompetence. It was doctrinal rigidity. Napoleon believed that authority solved problems. Britain bet that authority, stretched too far, created them. The British strategy did not defeat Napoleon directly. It shaped the environment in which he defeated himself. But shaping an environment does not come without consequences. The final question is not whether the strategy worked. It is what it cost, and whether success came at a price that reshaped Europe in ways no one fully anticipated. Because when a strategy wins by exhaustion, the damage does not end with the opponent. The strategy did not end with a single collapse. It ended with erosion. There was no moment when the continental system officially failed. No declaration that Britain had won the economic war. What emerged instead was a pattern: increasing strain, widening cracks, and decisions that carried escalating consequences. For Napoleon, the immediate outcome was not defeat, but entrapment. The system he built to isolate Britain began to isolate his own empire. Trade bottlenecks reduced revenue. Industrial shortages weakened dependent states. Local economies suffered without seeing strategic gain. Compliance became performative rather than real. Politically, the cost was severe. Allied rulers faced unrest. Merchants resisted quietly. Administrators burned out under impossible expectations. Loyalty eroded, not through rebellion, but through disengagement. The empire still functioned, but it no longer cooperated. The human cost was diffuse and brutal. Economic warfare does not produce battlefield casualties. It produces hunger, unemployment, and social instability. Port cities declined. Rural populations felt price shocks. Civilian suffering expanded far beyond military necessity. This suffering did not translate into unity against Britain. It translated into resentment toward Napoleon. The strategy succeeded because it redirected pain inward. For Britain, the cost was different, but not trivial. Maintaining the blockade strained naval logistics. Trade disruptions hurt domestic industries. Diplomatic relations with neutral states deteriorated. Legal and moral challenges mounted. Britain paid for endurance with patience, credibility, and internal cohesion. The political system absorbed dissent, but only barely. Victory required sustained institutional discipline, not public enthusiasm. The greatest cost was strategic precedent. By normalizing economic pressure as a primary weapon, Britain helped shift warfare into civilian space. Commerce became a target. Neutrality weakened. The boundary between war and peace blurred. This legacy would outlive Napoleon. Could the strategy have failed? Yes. If Britain's credit system had cracked. If neutral states had aligned decisively against enforcement. If Napoleon had adapted rather than doubled down. If internal British politics had fractured under prolonged strain. The strategy worked not because it was inevitable, but because multiple fragile conditions held long enough. It was not elegant. It was corrosive. And it raises a final question that history rarely asks directly. Was this a victory of strategic insight, or a demonstration of how modern war began to abandon the battlefield entirely? This strategy was never about starving Britain or collapsing France in isolation. It was about redefining where power actually resides in a modern conflict. Britain did not win by destroying Napoleon's armies. It won by exposing a structural mismatch between conquest and control. Napoleon mastered movement, concentration, and shock. Britain targeted endurance, compliance, and system maintenance. These two logics were incompatible. The strategy revealed a rule that traditional doctrine avoided. Power is not only the ability to seize territory. It is the ability to sustain systems under pressure. Napoleon expanded faster than his system could absorb. Every conquest increased administrative load, enforcement requirements, and political fragility. Britain's strategy did not create these weaknesses. It amplified them. This breaks a core assumption of classical military thought: that expansion equals strength. In reality, expansion increases surface area. More borders. More dependencies. More points of failure. The continental system was supposed to simplify the battlefield. Instead, it multiplied it. The second rule this strategy violated was the belief that pressure must be decisive to be effective. British pressure was deliberately ambiguous. It did not aim for immediate collapse. It aimed for miscalculation. It forced Napoleon into a binary choice: relax control and lose credibility, or tighten control and increase resistance. He chose control. This reveals a deeper principle. Unorthodox strategies succeed not by overwhelming an enemy, but by narrowing their perceived options. by shaping the decision environment until the opponent selects the most damaging response themselves. This is why the strategy depended on psychology as much as logistics. Napoleon's identity was bound to authority and enforcement. Britain bet that he would not tolerate leakage, ambiguity, or partial compliance. They did not need him to be wrong about economics. They needed him to be predictable about control. The third lesson is the most uncomfortable. This strategy worked because it externalized violence. Economic warfare displaces suffering away from battlefields and into civilian life. It operates through scarcity, disruption, and uncertainty. Its effects are slower, harder to measure, and morally diffuse. This makes it politically survivable for those who wield it, and devastating for those trapped inside it. The war against Napoleon marks a transition point. Here, warfare stops being confined to armies and begins to target systems. Trade, finance, legitimacy, compliance, perception. Once this threshold is crossed, wars no longer end cleanly. Victory becomes erosion. Defeat becomes exhaustion. The British strategy did not end warfare. It transformed it. And that transformation raises a final conclusion. Unorthodox strategies are not superior because they are clever. They are dangerous because they change the rules of what counts as a battlefield, and who pays the price. Napoleon lost not because he failed to fight, but because he fought in a world where control itself had become a liability. And once war becomes a contest of systems rather than armies, there are no clean victories. Only survivals. This was not a story of naval supremacy defeating continental genius. It was a story of two different theories of power colliding. One believed power was expressed through dominance and enforcement. The other believed power emerged from endurance, flexibility, and the ability to let pressure work quietly. Britain chose not to win fast. It chose to win last. That choice reshaped Europe. It reshaped warfare. And it left a legacy that modern conflicts still inherit, whether they acknowledge it or not. Because once commerce becomes a battlefield, and patience becomes a weapon, war no longer announces itself with cannon fire. It seeps. And the question is no longer who wins the next battle. It is who can survive the longest inside the system they built to win.